Welcome to our deep dive. You guys sent us some really interesting stuff from your UN503 class, Nuclear Energy and Society, Licensing and Regulation, and looking specifically at all the lecture PDFs on how nuclear energy is actually regulated here in Canada.
Yeah, it's a bit of a deep dive, but the mission here is not just to give you the rundown, the what, it's really to pull out the core ideas from all this material so you can really grasp not just what's being regulated, but the why and how of the whole system.
Yeah, exactly. It's more than just policy stuff. This course goes into like the practical, even some technical aspects, and we want to bring that to life for you. Think of it as getting the core of nuclear regulation in Canada without having to go through all those readings yourself. Okay, so let's just jump right into it. I think a basic question that probably comes to mind is, why is nuclear energy regulation a federal thing in Canada?
That is a great place to start. You might be thinking, well, couldn't other organizations, other bodies handle parts of this? Like, why not the RCMP for security or Environment Canada for environmental impacts? Could a province, say like Ontario with its, huge nuclear presence, could it have its own regulator? What about local authorities in areas that actually host these facilities? And then globally, what's the role of the IAEA?
All good questions. I think the answer really lies in how Canada is set up constitutionally. As your materials point out, the Constitution Act divides the powers to make laws, the legislative powers, between the feds and the provinces. Each level of government has its own specific areas where it can make laws.
Right. And what's interesting is nuclear energy is specifically a federal thing. So Section 92 of the Constitution Act gives Parliament the power over, well, it says, works for the general advantage of Canada or for the advantage of two or more of the provinces. But it also specifically calls out any work or undertaking constructed for the development, production, or use of nuclear energy. So right from the start, this decision shows that nuclear technology is seen as nationally important, but also inherently risky. So it needs that centralized control.
So it puts it under federal jurisdiction.
Yeah.
But it's not just the CNSC, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, that's involved in keeping nuclear power plants safe, right? The core stuff mentions a bunch of other federal organizations with specific roles.
Absolutely. If we zoom out a bit, you see that ensuring nuclear safety and security is a shared responsibility across different levels of government. So, for example, you have Health Canada setting the radiological protection guidelines, and they lead on the federal nuclear emergency plan. But it's the provincial emergency authorities that would actually plan and do the response on the ground if, God forbid, a nuclear emergency happened.
Right. And what about Natural Resources Canada? They seem to have like a broader role.
Yeah, they do. Natural Resources Canada runs things like the Nuclear Energy Act and the Nuclear Liability and Compensation Act. They also shape those policies for energy science and technology, and they've been key in developing the action plan for SMRs, small modular reactors. And then you have Public Safety Canada, and they're responsible for the Federal Emergency Response Plan, which covers all kinds of hazards, so they have a big coordinating role there.
And transporting nuclear materials, that seems like a natural fit for Transport Canada, right?
Exactly. Transport Canada is the one that makes the regs for moving stuff around in Canada by any method. And that includes making sure dangerous goods are transported safely. And radioactive material falls under what they call Class 7 in those regulations. Environment and Climate Change Canada, they do their part in protecting the environment, of course, and they review nuclear project proposals under the Impact Assessment Act. And lastly, Global Affairs Canada handles our nuclear non-proliferation policy and manages all those international agreements related to nuclear energy. So you can see it's this whole network of players with the CNSC at the center.
So the CNSC, that's the main regulatory body. Can you give us a little history on them?
Sure. The CNSC came about in May 2000 under the Nuclear Safety and Control Act, or as everyone calls it, the NSCA. The thing is, it replaced the Atomic Energy Control Board, which had been around since 1946. So this change in 2000 really shows that we needed a separate body with the clear power to regulate all things nuclear without being influenced.
And their main mission, as I see in the materials, is pretty straightforward.
It is. The CNSC regulates the use of nuclear energy and materials, and their top goal is to protect health, safety, security, and the environment. And this mission really guides everything they do, like issuing licenses, doing inspections, and making sure everyone follows the rules.
Now let's get into the laws that govern all of this. We're talking about acts, regulations, licenses, and certificates. It's kind of a jungle.
It can feel that way, but the key is understanding how it's all organized. The course material really drives home the point that acts passed by the Parliament are the top dogs in Canadian law. And in this case, the Nuclear Safety and Control Act, the NSCA, is the foundation. Think of it as the big umbrella law, setting out the basic principles and giving the CNSC its power.
And then you've got regulations. Where do they fit in?
Regulations aren't made directly by Parliament, but by whoever Parliament specifically gives that power to in an act. It could be the governor and council, or even a minister. Regulations spell out the nitty-gritty, the practical rules and steps for how to actually put the act into practice and enforce it. So you have regulations like the nuclear substances and radiation devices regulations, or the general nuclear safety and control regulations. These give you the specifics for actually implementing the NSCA.
And then there's licenses, which seem to be essential for doing anything related to nuclear stuff in Canada.
Totally. Section 26 of the NSCA is very clear. You can't possess, transfer, use, mine, produce, operate, or even decommission nuclear substances or facilities without a valid license. These licenses aren't forever. They have a set time limit and come with conditions that you have to follow strictly. And the CNSC needs to be completely satisfied that the applicant is qualified and will do the job safely, protecting the environment, health, safety, and national security before they issue a license. That's why the licensing process is so long and has so many stages. It's all about safety first, and there are checks and balances at every step in the life of a nuclear facility.
Right. And the materials talk about different kinds of licenses, like a power reactor operating license or PROL.
Exactly. For nuclear facilities, you've got different types of licenses for each stage. Getting the site ready, LTPS, building the facility, LTC, running it, LTO, and even taking it apart when it's done, LTD. Besides facilities, the CNSC also gives out certificates that let people do specific jobs, approve equipment, and even deal with packaging and transporting nuclear stuff.
Okay, so that's the legal side. Let's talk about the CNSC itself. How are they set up to do all this important work?
The CNSC is really well structured. At the top is the Commission, which is the independent decision maker for everything licensing and regulatory. The Commission hearings are a big deal, often a formal 2-day public process. The applicant and CNSC staff both present their sides, and then anyone who's registered to intervene, it could be the public or any interested party, can share their views. But these hearings can also be held in camera, which means privately if there's a good reason.
That's something to keep in mind. And below the commission, you've got the CNSC staff. How are they organized?
Reporting to the president, there are several key branches and divisions. The Legal and Commission Affairs branch provides legal expertise to the commission and staff and manages the commission registry, which handles planning hearings and meetings. Then there's the Internal Audit, Evaluation, and Ethics division, which provides independent oversight. And then you have 4 main branches. The Regulatory Operations Branch, which oversees the operation of power reactors and other nuclear cycle facilities. The Technical Support Branch, which provides specialized scientific and technical expertise. The Regulatory Affairs Branch, which is in charge of developing policies, managing communications, and handling international relations. And finally, the Corporate Services Branch, which manages all the essential internal stuff like HR, finance, and IT. While it's good to know about these different divisions, the main takeaway is that the CNSC's structure helps them regulate nuclear safety independently in every way.
So it's this big organized system with different parts focusing on specific regulations. Let's zoom in on the licensing process for nuclear facilities, especially those Class I facilities that are highlighted in the materials. When exactly do you need a license besides just having nuclear substances?
For nuclear facilities, we touched on this earlier, you need a license for every major stage. Getting the site ready, constructing, operating, and decommissioning Class 1 and 2 facilities. You'll see the abbreviations LTPS, LTC, LTO, and LTD. Those represent the critical phases. You also need a license to completely abandon a facility or even for a nuclear-powered vehicle, like bringing one into Canada.
And what are the general things you need to include when you apply for a license?
The General Nuclear Safety and Control Regulations, which everyone shortens to GNSCR, those lay out the basic requirements. So you need your basic information like your name, contact details, then a clear explanation of what you're asking for a license for, the types and amounts of any nuclear substances involved, a detailed description of the facility or equipment you'll be using, and then a complete plan of how you'll comply with the regulations for radiation protection, security, and transporting nuclear substances. You also have to propose specific action levels for your radiation protection program and describe how you'll control who can access the site and the nuclear materials.
And for those specific Class I facilities, are there more specific requirements for the application?
Yeah, the Class I regulations go beyond the general requirements and get more specific. They require a really thorough description of the proposed site, including any exclusion zones, a detailed breakdown of how the facility is designed, the qualifications and experience of the people who'll be working there, your radiation protection program for the facility, and very importantly, a preliminary plan for how you'll eventually decommission the facility and handle the waste. You also need to explain how you'll keep people living near the site informed about any potential environmental, health, and safety effects.
Okay, so let's break down a couple of these specific license types. What's generally involved in applying for a license to prepare site, or LTPS?
For an LTPS application, besides the general info, you have to give a really detailed description of how you evaluated the site, including all the investigations and prep work you've done and what you plan to do. You also need to assess how vulnerable the site is to natural events like earthquakes or floods. You'll lay out your program for figuring out the existing environmental characteristics of the area. You'll describe the quality assurance program you'll have in place for the design of the facility, and detail any potential environmental, health, and safety effects from the site prep work itself, and how you'll minimize those impacts.
Okay, and what about the big one, the license to construct, or LTC? What does that application look like?
The LTC application, that's way more detailed. You need to provide a super thorough description of how the facility is designed, clearly showing how you've taken the site's physical and environmental features into account. You include all that detailed environmental data you collected, a full construction schedule with timelines, descriptions of all the structures, systems, and components of the facility, a preliminary safety analysis report showing that the design is safe, the quality assurance program you'll use during design and construction, and how you'll make sure Canada sticks to international safeguards agreements. And importantly, you have to detail the potential environmental, health, and safety effects not only of the construction, but also of running the facility and eventually taking it apart, plus your detailed plans to minimize those effects. This includes outlining any potential releases of nuclear or hazardous substances, the control measures you'll put in place, and your plans for hiring, training, and ensuring the qualifications of all the people who will work at the facility. And if you plan to use a full-scope training simulator for operator training, you need to describe that too.
That sounds like a massive amount of information. What about the license to operate, or LTO? What's needed for that one?
For the LTO, you need to give updated and final descriptions of the facility structures, systems, and components, a final safety analysis report that shows the facility, as built, is safe, the detailed steps, policies, methods, and procedures you'll use to run and maintain the facility, specific procedures for safely handling and storing all nuclear and hazardous substances on site, and your complete emergency preparedness plans. You also have to reiterate the specific locations and maximum amounts of any planned releases of radioactive or hazardous substances, how you'll control them, and your detailed plans for preventing and dealing with any accidental releases. This includes how you'll coordinate with and assist offsite authorities in an emergency response, and how you'll regularly test and practice those measures. And finally, you also need to describe in detail how you'll prevent sabotage at the facility.
So it's a very step-by-step and incredibly detailed process, really reflecting that safety-first idea we talked about. And the materials even give some timelines for these different stages, right?
They do. So for a typical Class IA facility, you're looking at about 24 months for the CNSC to go through an LTPS application, 32 months for an LTC, and maybe 40 months for a combined LTC and the initial LTO. A standalone LTO application takes about 24 months too. And a license to decommission, that also has a general processing time of about 24 months. And then the whole hearing process for a Class I facility usually takes about 12 to 18 months from when the CNSC staff decide the application's complete and ready for review.
And what about the specific steps in the licensing timeline? The course breaks it down into 9 steps.
Right. It starts with the CNSC staff officially telling the registry to schedule public hearings. After that, they put out a notice of public hearing, which is made public to let everyone know and invite them to participate. This notice also includes details about the participant funding program, which helps people get involved. Then, both the CNSC staff and the applicant have to submit their detailed technical and safety stuff, and that all becomes public. CNSC staff also prepare this big document called the Commission Member Document, where they outline their assessment of the application and their recommendations. Sometimes either side might submit additional information. Then comes hearing part 1, which is a technical hearing. Here, CNSC staff and the applicant present their cases and answer questions from the commission members. The public usually can't participate in this part. After that, registered interveners submit their written stuff, and again, CNSC staff and the applicant might give more info in response. Then you have hearing part 2, and this is specifically for the public. This is where registered interveners can present their perspectives to the commission, either by speaking or in writing. The commission members can then ask everyone questions. Finally, the commission discusses everything and they publish their decision. It's called the Record of Decision, usually within 60 days.
The course also mentions something called the CNSC Rules of Procedure Regulations. What are those for?
Those regs, officially SOR 2002-11, basically lay out the formal rules and guidelines for how the CNSC makes its decisions. They explain the steps for public hearings, how individuals and organizations can participate and be heard, the process for appealing decisions, and how the Commission issues formal orders. These regulations are really important for anyone involved in the nuclear sector because they spell out exactly how and when to file documents and interact with the Commission.
And this whole detailed process is based on the idea of risk-informed regulation, right?
That's it. The CNSC's whole approach to regulation is risk-informed, meaning the more risky an activity is to health, safety, security, and the environment, the more scrutiny and oversight it gets. Which makes sense, right? You'd expect way more attention on a big nuclear reactor than, say, a small, sealed radioactive source used for medical imaging in a hospital. Think of it like airport security high-risk areas like baggage check get way more screening than just walking through the terminal.
Okay, let's switch gears a bit and talk about the Impact Assessment Act. How does this fit into nuclear regulation in Canada?
The Impact Assessment Act, or IAA, is important because it expands environmental reviews for certain projects, and that includes big nuclear projects. It's basically there to make sure that both the good and bad environmental, social, and economic effects of projects are considered. It emphasizes early and meaningful public and Indigenous engagement in the assessment process. It wants to create partnerships with Indigenous peoples when doing assessments, and it requires decisions to be based on solid scientific evidence, Indigenous knowledge, and other relevant information, all while considering the possible cumulative environmental effects on a region.
So which nuclear projects actually have to go through a formal impact assessment under this act?
The physical activities regulations, which some people call the project list, that's under the IAA. They list the specific types of projects that need a federal impact assessment. For nuclear reactors, whether fission or fusion, it usually includes building, running, and decommissioning new reactors if they have a total thermal power output that's combined of more than 900 megawatts thermal, or MWth, when they're on the same site as an existing Class IA nuclear facility, or if it's a new site, more than 200 milliweth. But it's important to note that the Minister of Environment and Climate Change can decide to make any project go through an impact assessment if it might have serious negative effects on the environment.
The IAA process itself has three main phases, right? Planning, then preparing the impact statement, and then the impact assessment.
Right. The first phase, planning, is pretty short, 180 days. The project proponent gives an initial description of the project. Then, a summary of potential issues is put together, followed by a more detailed project description from the proponent. The Impact Assessment Agency of Canada reviews all this and decides if a formal impact assessment is needed. If it is, they develop impact statement guidelines, or TIS for short, that tell the proponent what needs to be in their impact statement, plus a plan for engaging the public and Indigenous peoples. The next phase is the impact statement. The proponent uses the guidelines to make a detailed report about the potential impacts of their project. They have up to 3 years for this. And finally, the impact assessment phase is where the agency, or sometimes an independent review panel, really digs into the proponent's impact statement. This phase involves ongoing consultations with Indigenous peoples, reviewing public comments, and it all leads to a big impact assessment report. After the report is submitted, the Minister of Environment and Climate Change has 90 days to decide if the project can go ahead, maybe with conditions, or they can send it to the Governor and Council for a final decision.
Public and Indigenous engagement seem to be big themes throughout this whole regulatory system. What are the specific requirements for engagement in nuclear projects?
The CNSC has specific regulatory documents for both public and Indigenous engagement. There's Reg GOC 3.2.1, Public Information and Disclosure. It outlines what licensees and applicants for Class 1 and 2 nuclear facilities, and also uranium mines and mills, need to do to set up and maintain public information programs throughout the entire life of a facility, from planning to decommissioning. This includes specific requirements for keeping records of their public information activities and how they disclose information. For Indigenous engagement, there's Reg GOC 3.2.2, Indigenous engagement. It gives specific requirements and practical guidance to licensees so they can follow a consistent government-wide approach to consulting and engaging with Indigenous peoples.
What are some of the key steps licensees need to take to engage with Indigenous peoples?
They need to be proactive in identifying and engaging with potentially affected Indigenous groups early on, submit a full Indigenous engagement report to the CNSC, give regular updates on any major changes to the project or its potential impacts, and include a clear summary of their engagement activities and any outcomes in their regular reports to the Commission. The Indigenous Engagement Report itself has to specifically list all the Indigenous groups they've engaged with, provide a detailed summary of both past and planned engagement activities, and outline when they'll give future updates to the CNSC. It's super important for licensees to thoroughly document everything, track any issues or concerns raised by Indigenous groups, and clearly explain how they're addressing or plan to address those concerns.
Okay, let's talk about management systems. The materials highlight how important they are in regulation and licensing. What exactly is a management system in this context?
Basically, a management system here is a structured and constantly improving set of processes and procedures that helps an organization achieve its goals, with safety being the top goal in the nuclear world. It's about creating a framework that ensures you're always improving by having clear rules, roles, responsibilities, and systematic processes for planning, doing, checking, and acting. The CNSC has issued two key RegDOCs for management systems. RegDOC 2.1.1, which aligns with the Canadian Standards Association, that's CSA Standard N28612, and RegDOC 2.1.2, which focuses on creating a strong safety culture within the organization.
And CSA N28612 is presented as a pretty important standard in these materials, right?
Absolutely. CSA N28612 gives a comprehensive set of management system requirements specifically for nuclear facilities, integrating requirements related to health, safety, environmental protection, security, economic performance, and quality assurance. It's not just a quality management standard, it's a whole framework designed to make sure every part of a nuclear facility's operations is managed well and safely. CSA N28612 is based on 12 basic principles, and safety is the most important one, guiding all decisions and actions.
Okay, so CNSC RegDOC 2.1.1 then lists some specific things a good management system should include. What are some of the most important ones?
RegDOC 2.1.1 highlights key elements like strong leadership, which emphasizes the role of leaders in creating and supporting a good safety culture. Safety culture itself looks at the shared values, attitudes, and understandings within an organization that influence how workers act and make decisions about safety. Supply chain management is another one, specifically focusing on preventing counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect items, or CFSI, from getting into the supply chain. Then there's robust configuration management, which makes sure the physical plant matches its design documents. And finally, effective software quality assurance processes for any software used in safety-related applications.
Let's talk more about safety culture. Why is it so important in the nuclear industry?
Having a strong safety culture is a major factor in reducing the chances of safety incidents and minimizing their impact if they do happen. It's about making safety a part of everyone's daily work and decisions, not just a set of rules or a separate program. Leaders and managers at every level need to actively build this culture by making it clear that safety is the #1 priority. They need to use the management system to constantly assess, understand, and improve safety culture through assessments, feedback, and by encouraging open communication and questioning potential safety issues.
And CFSI counterfeit, fraudulent, and suspect items, that sounds like a big concern, especially with today's complex and global supply chains. What are the risks and how are they managed?
It's a huge concern. CFSI are basically things that are misrepresented. Their quality, specs, or certifications are fake. The risks they pose in a nuclear facility where everything needs to be reliable can be really bad. They could lead to equipment failures and safety compromises. To deal with these risks, you need a strong management system that includes constant audits of suppliers, a strict process for choosing qualified vendors, clear purchasing rules that focus on quality and traceability, strong verification and testing for incoming items, ways to manage subsuppliers, and good systems for learning from past CFSI issues. That Bloomberg article you mentioned, the one about fake parts being found on Boeing and Airbus planes, really shows how bad CFSI can be in industries where safety is critical. That's why those strict controls are so important in nuclear.
Definitely a wake-up call. What about software quality assurance and human performance management? Those were also mentioned as key parts of the management system.
For any software used in safety-related design, analysis, or control functions, the CSA standard N286.7 sets out specific quality assurance requirements. This is especially important for high-energy reactor facilities, but it also gives good guidance for other licensees using safety-critical software. Human performance management is about making sure licensees have enough qualified people with the right knowledge, skills, tools, and procedures to do their jobs safely and effectively. The CNSC has several Reg GOC specifically for this. Reg GOC 2.2.1 on human performance itself, Reg GOC 2.2.2 on personnel training, and Reg GOC 2.2.3 on personnel certification.
Let's touch on those human performance RegGDOCs. What are some of the key things they emphasize?
Reg DAPDOC 2.2.1 on human performance says that it's important to have a systematic approach to managing human performance, providing enough support to workers so they can do their jobs well and safely, actively learning from both successes and mistakes, constantly monitoring and evaluating human performance programs, and making sure senior management is accountable for the outcomes. Reg JACH 2.2.2 on personnel training lays out the requirements for setting up and keeping a strong training system, covering everything from figuring out training needs to designing and developing programs, implementing them effectively, evaluating them thoroughly, documenting everything, and managing and overseeing the whole thing. It stresses how important it is to keep accurate training records for everyone and make sure all workers get proper training on nuclear safety principles relevant to their jobs. RegGDOC 2.2.3 is about certifying people in key safety-sensitive roles in reactor facilities. It also includes requirements for reporting on fitness for duty, focusing on things like alcohol and drug use that could affect someone's ability to work safely. And finally, RegGDOC 2.2.5 gives guidance on setting up and maintaining a proper minimum shift complement. This is to ensure that there are enough qualified workers on duty at all times, including people with specialized skills beyond the basic qualifications of certified operators.
Okay, let's move on to the operational and technical safety areas, SCAs 3 through 6. We've got a operating performance, safety analysis, physical design, and fitness for service. We don't have time to go into all of them in detail, but can you give us a quick overview and then focus on safety analysis?
Sure. Operating Performance, SCA Test 3, looks at how well an organization does its day-to-day operations. It's about sticking to established policies and procedures to make sure the facility is run safely and under control. Physical Design, SCA Tech 5, focuses on whether the facility's systems and structures can actually do what they're designed to do over their lifetime, taking into account things like new operational experience and potential changes in the external environment. Fitness for Service, SCA Tech 6, is all about making sure that all the important systems and components stay in good working order through inspections, maintenance, and managing the effects of aging.
And safety analysis, SCA Tech 4, is super important because it backs up a lot of the safety claims for a nuclear facility, right?
Right. Safety analysis involves looking at all the potential dangers associated with the facility and carefully checking how effective the safety measures are. It uses two main approaches: deterministic safety analysis, or DSA, and probabilistic safety assessment, or PSA. DSA is about figuring out what would happen if certain accidents were to occur and checking that the facility can handle them, set safe operating limits, and develop procedures for dealing with unexpected events. PSA, on the other hand, looks at all the different ways things could go wrong, their probabilities, and what could lead to bad outcomes, like damage to the reactor core or releases of radioactive material. The CNSC requires both Level 1 and Level 2 PSAs for licensed nuclear facilities.
What are some of the main goals of deterministic safety analysis, according to the course materials?
The main things DSA tries to do are to confirm that the facility's design meets all the safety rules and can handle tough situations, like accidents. It's also about verifying that the design includes multiple layers of protection, that's defense in depth, to prevent accidents and minimize their consequences. DSA also helps determine safe operating limits and conditions for the plant, and provides a basis for developing and testing the procedures that operators use to handle abnormal and accident situations. Ultimately, DSA helps show that the facility can meet its safety goals and that the design and operational practices are strong enough.
And what kinds of events are usually analyzed in a deterministic safety analysis?
DSA typically looks at a bunch of different things, starting with anticipated operational occurrences, or AOOs, which are small deviations from normal operation that you expect to happen at least once during the plant's life. Then it looks at design basis accidents, or DBAs, which are more serious but still something the plant is designed to handle. And finally, DSA considers beyond design basis accidents, or BDBAs, which are less common and potentially worse than DBAs. These can include design extension conditions, or DECs, which involve additional safety features or tougher procedures, and severe accidents, which means serious damage to the reactor core.
The idea of defense in depth is also important for safety analysis, isn't it?
Absolutely. Defense in depth is like the foundation of nuclear safety. It's about having multiple independent layers of protection to prevent accidents and, if they happen, to limit what happens. Usually there are 5 levels: preventing things from going wrong in the first place, controlling things when they do go wrong, having safety systems to stop an accident from getting worse, managing severe accidents to minimize core damage, and finally, minimizing the impact of any release of radioactive material. DSA plays a big role in confirming that all these layers are working. For example, by analyzing DBAs, DSA can show how well those engineered safety features, the 3rd level of defense, can prevent releases of radioactive material.
Let's talk about probabilistic safety assessment, or PSA. What are its main goals, and how does it work with deterministic safety analysis?
The main goals of PSA are to find all the potential sequences of events that could lead to problems, like damage to the reactor core or releases of radioactive material, and then figure out how likely they are. It works with DSA by giving a broader view of potential risks. Instead of focusing on specific accidents, it considers a wider range of scenarios and their probabilities. PSA helps make plant design and operations safer and helps figure out how important different systems and components are for overall safety. It also provides a way to evaluate the safety impact of changes to the plant's design or operating procedures.
The materials mention different levels of PSA Level 1, Level 2, and Level 3. What do those mean?
Level 1 PSA focuses on figuring out how likely it is that a sequence of events could damage the reactor core. This is usually expressed as the core damage frequency, or CDF. Level 2 PSA takes that information and goes further, analyzing the containment system and how likely radioactive material is to be released into the environment. It quantifies things like the small release frequency, SRF, and the large release frequency, LRF. Level 3 PSA, which the CNSC doesn't currently require for power reactors, takes it even further and models how those radionuclides would spread in the environment and what the potential impact on public health and the economy would be.
REGI DOC 2.4.2 lists specific requirements for doing PSA for nuclear power plants. What are some of the key things licensees need to address?
Key requirements in REGI DOC 2.4.2 include having a complete and up-to-date PSA program, doing both Level 1 and Level 2 PSAs that consider all the sources of radioactivity at the site and what could happen if multiple units were affected. They also have to update their PSA models to reflect the current configuration of the plant and include any significant design or procedural changes. The PSA needs to look at all the credible events and hazards that could affect the plant, both internal and external. It has to be based on realistic assumptions and use plant-specific or generic data that's backed up by good engineering assessments. The level of detail in the model needs to be appropriate for how it's going to be used and for the plant's operational programs. Licensees have to get the CNSC's approval for the methods and computer codes they use in their PSA. The PSA also needs to consider all the different ways the plant can operate, including when it's running and when it's shut down. Thorough documentation of everything is essential, and the PSA program should be independently reviewed from time to time to make sure it's good quality and complete. Finally, the REGI DOC also mentions the CNSC's safety goals, which include targets for CDF, SRF, and LRF.
Okay, last thing in this section on operational and technical safety areas. Let's quickly talk about fitness for service, SCHA TIC 6. This is about making sure the plant's physical stuff stays reliable and in good condition, right?
Exactly. Fitness for service is everything you do to make sure the important systems, structures, and components of the nuclear facility stay functional and structurally sound throughout their life. This includes things like engineering assessments, regular inspections, preventative and corrective maintenance, and aging management programs to address the long-term effects of operation on materials and components. The relevant REGI DOCs in this area cover things like reliability programs, maintenance programs, and aging management.
All right, we've covered a lot on the basics and technical stuff. Let's move on to the health, safety, and environment safety control areas, SCA 7, 8, 9, and 11. Let's start with radiation protection, SCA Tag 7. What are the main goals here?
The main goal of radiation protection is to protect people and the environment from the risks of ionizing radiation from nuclear activities. The CNSC requires licensees to develop and implement programs to effectively monitor and control contamination and radiation doses to both workers and the public. These programs have to make sure all radiation exposures are below the CNSC's limits and, just as importantly, as low as reasonably achievable, which is called LLRA. This means considering social, economic, and technical factors.
And the main regulations for radiation protection in Canada are the Radiation Protection Regulations, or RPR, right?
Yes, specifically SOR 2002-03. It's worth noting that there are some exceptions. For instance, they generally don't apply to people who volunteer for biomedical research involving radiation or to patients and their immediate caregivers during medical diagnosis or treatment, although professional healthcare providers are still covered. RPR Section 3 specifically requires licensees who provide nuclear substances for therapy to give the patient clear information on how to minimize radiation exposure to other people.
Then, RPR Section 4 lists what every radiation protection program needs to include. What are those core components?
RPR Section 4 says that every licensee has to create, implement, and maintain a solid radiation protection program that puts the ALARA principle first. This means having strong management control over work involving radiation, making sure people are qualified and trained, controlling occupational and public radiation exposure, and having plans and procedures for unexpected situations. The regulations also require licensees to figure out the amount and concentration of any radioactive substances released from the facility, either by directly measuring it with monitoring equipment or, if that's not possible, using validated estimation techniques. Good management control means strong commitment from senior management, clear roles and responsibilities for radiation protection, and